I was always convinced that trains were just transportation, a normal way to get from one point to another. I never thought that one of them would change my life forever, turning it into a real nightmare. It was already late when I got on the train to a small town that few people knew about. There was an unusual silence in the carriage, only the faint noise of the wheels disturbed it. There were not many passengers, and I thought that this night flight would be quiet and even a little boring. But as soon as the train started, I felt something strange. My skin crawled with goosebumps, and I felt something was wrong. It was as if the very walls of this old carriage had their own dark history. I was sitting by the window looking at the darkness beyond, and suddenly I noticed someone sitting behind me in the reflection of the window. I clearly remember that I was the only one in the car. I turned around and saw no one. I looked out the window again, and the figure had disappeared. My heart beat faster, and I felt that this was just the beginning of something terrible. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself that it was just the play of shadows or my tiredness after a long day. But the feeling of anxiety did not go away. The carriage seemed to be filled with a heavy, sticky air that squeezed me from all sides. Time dragged on endlessly, and each hit of the wheels on the rails sounded like a countdown to something unknown. I tried not to think about it, diverting my attention to the surrounding trifles. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound that pulled me out of my thoughts. It was a whisper. I turned my head, but again saw no one. Only empty seats that looked as if someone was about to return to their seat. Then I decided to get up and walk around the carriage to see if I was really alone. All the seats were empty. I walked from one end of the carriage to the other, but there was not a soul anywhere. It seemed that I was in a kind of trap, where time and reality were mixed into something absurd and terrible. When I returned to my seat, I heard a knock, this time strong and distinct. It sounded from somewhere below, as if from under the wagon. My pulse quickened, and I began to feel more and more restless. I bent down to look under the seat, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the light in the carriage began to flash. My heart jumped in my chest, and I realized that something terrible was beginning. The light in the carriage flickered more and more often, and every time it came back on, I felt something dark and cold approaching. This sense of an invisible presence was so intense that I began to look around, looking for where the danger might come from. Then the carriage was engulfed in total darkness, and for a moment I was left in complete darkness. All I could hear was my own rapid breathing and the echoes of the train's wheels. But suddenly, this knocking began to change, becoming more uneven and rhythmic, as if someone was walking on the roof of the car. I froze, trying to figure out if it was my imagination. But the sound was real. He was getting closer, and I thought I heard the heavy breathing that accompanied those steps. It was simply impossible because I was inside the train, and no one could easily walk on its roof while it was moving. The footsteps stopped right above my head. My heart was holding on by a thread to prevent it from bursting out of my chest. I was afraid to even breathe, hoping it was just some mistake and it would be over as quickly as it started. But suddenly something heavy and rough hit the roof of the car, as if someone had jumped on it from above. The vibration went through the metal and I felt it go through my body. It was no longer a game of imagination. Something or someone was there above my head, trying to get inside. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. The carriage swayed as if the train had been caught in some unexpected turbulence. I pressed myself against the back of the seat, not knowing what to do. There was nowhere to run, and I stayed where I was, trying to understand what was happening and what to do next. For a few seconds, that felt like an eternity. I sat in complete darkness, feeling every nerve in my body strained to the limit. The sounds on the roof of the car died down, and there was such an oppressive silence that it almost deafened me. I couldn't believe it was all real. Something invisible, something that wasn't supposed to be here, haunted me on this night train. Suddenly the light flashed again, but this time it did not return to its normal state. Instead of a bright white light, the carriages were filled with a strange red shade that cast eerie shadows on the walls and seats. My blood froze in my veins when I noticed that these shadows were not moving as they should. I looked away from the shadows, hoping it was just an illusion, but I couldn't ignore what was happening around me. Suddenly, through the windows, I saw figures that flashed quickly in the darkness outside the train. They were human in form, but their outlines were indistinct and distorted. They appeared and disappeared so quickly that I barely had time to recognize them. These figures seemed to be watching me as if they were part of this horrific scenario. A shiver ran through my hands as I realized that it was not a reflection or a play of light. They were really there. I could feel their presence, their gazes piercing through me. Then I heard a scream. It was not a human scream, but something so ominous and eerie that my instinct told me to run. But there was nowhere to run. The wagon became a trap from which there was no way out. Just as I decided to try to open the door and move to another car, it slammed shut on its own, cutting off any way I could escape. My fear turned into panic. I understood that something terrible was already here, inside with me, and it was not going to let me go just like that. My hands were shaking as I tried to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed that they were locked firmly on the other side. I started pushing the door with all my might, but it was no use. The feeling of hopelessness rolled in like a wave, and I had only one thought: how to get out of here alive. Suddenly, the same whisper that I heard earlier appeared in the carriage. But now it sounded louder and more insistent, as if someone was trying to convey an important message to me, but the words were too blurry and indistinct. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but no one was there. Just this whisper that echoed in my head, making me feel like I was losing my mind. When I returned to my seat, I saw that there was something lying on the seat opposite me that had not been there before. It was an old, battered envelope that looked like it had been there for years. I had the feeling that his appearance here was not accidental. I slowly reached out to take the envelope, and when my fingers touched it, I felt an icy coldness run through my body, as if some dark secret was hidden in this paper rectangle. I tore open the edge of the envelope and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. It had a few words written on it, written in an old handwriting that was barely legible. "Don't trust the light. It's a trap." My heart stopped and I panicked. What does this mean, and why me? My mind was torn between the desire to understand and the fear of what it might mean. At that moment, the lights in the carriage began to flicker again, this time faster and more chaotically. I realized that this was my warning. The light that flickered on and off wasn't just a malfunction, it was a signal, perhaps the last one I needed to understand before it was too late. My heart was beating wildly, each beat reverberating through my mind, drowning out logical thought. The warning note trembled in my hands as if it were alive. The words, "Don't trust the light, it's a trap," sounded like a sentence, and I realized that it was impossible to stay here any longer. My first instinct was to turn off the lights in the car, but when I looked around, I realized that I couldn't see any switches. The lighting system seemed to be automatic, and I had no control over it. All I could do was try not to panic and find a way to escape from this horrible place. Suddenly, as the light faded again, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned sharply and my eyes focused on a dark silhouette that appeared near the end of the carriage. It was a man, or something that had a human form. Her face was hidden in the shadows, and I couldn't make out any features, but I felt that this silhouette had been watching me for some time. I took a step back and the silhouette slowly began to move in my direction. His steps were so quiet I could barely hear them, but each step brought him closer and closer to me. My first thought was to run away, but my legs seemed to have grown to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off this creepy creature that was closing in on me. With each step, the figure became clearer, and I noticed that her movements were unnatural, as if she was barely in control of her body. As the silhouette drew closer, I felt the air grow heavier, and a terrible cold enveloped me. This creature was something else, did not belong to our world, and its presence was somehow related to what was happening with the train. Finally, I mustered the remaining strength and rushed to the door, trying to open it. To my surprise, the door gave way and opened with a deafening creak. I jumped out of the car and found myself on the narrow passage between the cars, where the wild wind tore at my jacket and hair. On the other side was the same dark creature that was now standing at the entrance to the carriage from which I had just exited. I understood that there was no going back. I had to move forward, even if I didn't know what lay ahead. My only hope was to run as far away from this shadow as I could before it reached me. I ran through the cold wind, sliding between the cars on the narrow metal passage. My steps echoed with a dull thump against the metal, mixing with the rhythmic rumble of the train's wheels. The dark figure was left behind, but I felt its presence like a shadow still haunting me. Opening the door of the next car, I ran inside and stopped for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Unlike the previous carriage, this one looked much older and neglected. Cobwebs of dust covered the corners, and a cold wind blew through the broken windows. There was almost no lighting, only a faint red light pouring through the cracks in the lamps, creating a ghostly atmosphere. I moved on, looking intently into the darkness that hid everything around. The feeling that someone was watching me did not leave me. I heard only my steps, but these sounds seemed alien to me, like the echo of something walking next to me. Suddenly I saw something strange. On the floor, at the very edge of the circle of light falling from the lamp, there was an old wooden box. She looked completely out of place in the carriage, where there was nothing but empty seats and dust. I hesitated, but some force pushed me to come closer. The casket was heavy in appearance, covered with cracks and darkened by time. I sat down to examine it and noticed that a name was carved into the lid. It was almost obliterated, but I could read, Robert. This name seemed familiar to me, although I could not remember from where. Succumbing to a strange curiosity, I took hold of the lid and slowly lifted it. Inside the box lay an old notebook wrapped in leather with pages yellowed by time. I took it in my hands, and at the same moment I felt a chill that came not from the air, but from the very essence of this notebook. I opened it and my eyes rested on the first lines, written in nervous handwriting. If you're reading this, know that the train won't let you go. Robert. My blood froze. Robert. The same Robert whose name was on the casket. And what did he mean? I continued to read, and each word I skimmed dragged me deeper into the darkness surrounding this train and its mysteries. Every word written in the notebook seemed to belong to a man struggling with fear and madness. The handwriting was uneven. In places, spots from tears or sweat had blurred the ink, making some phrases almost illegible. I could feel the chills growing inside me as I read about what Robert went through on that train. He wrote that he got on this train by accident during an ordinary trip home. At first, everything was as usual, until he realized that he got off at the wrong station where he planned. The train moved on, and Robert found the doors closed and the lights flickering. He was also being chased by a dark silhouette similar to the one I saw. But what he described next was even more terrifying. Robert wrote about how time on the train began to warp. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. He lost track of time, and the sense of reality gradually disappeared. The empty carriages were filled with ghostly figures whispering terrible things to him, and he could no longer distinguish between what was a dream and what was waking. "This train is a trap," wrote Robert. "It doesn't stop. It pulls you further and further until you lose yourself. The only way out is to find the heart of the train, the source of its power, and stop it. But that's almost impossible." The last lines of the notebook were written almost illegibly. "If you're reading this, you're already doomed. They won't let you go until you become one of them." I closed the notebook, feeling my hands shake with fear. The entire carriage seemed to be engulfed in a thick fog, making it impossible to see anything clearly. My thoughts swirled in a vortex of panic. What does the heart of the train mean? How can I find it in this nightmare? I had to act fast before I drowned in the same horror that engulfed Robert. I knew one thing. I couldn't stay still. I had to move forward, even if I didn't know what lay ahead. It was important to find a way to stop this train before it completely destroyed my reality. I got up, holding the notebook as my only clue, and continued through the car, hoping to find some sign that would point me to the exit or to what Robert called the heart of the train. Feeling the fog around me grow thicker and thicker, I continued through the carriage. Each step was difficult, as if I was making my way through an invisible resistance. The notebook in my hands felt heavy, as if its pages were pulling me down. But I knew I had to go on. My only hope was to find what Robert called the heart of the train. Each carriage I passed seemed even creepier than the last. The windows were covered with a thick layer of dust, through which a dim red light could barely penetrate. My footsteps echoed off the walls, making me feel like I wasn't alone. In every corner, in every shadow, I could see something terrible, but I forced myself to go forward. Finally, I reached a carriage that was different from the others. His door was locked, but the lock looked old and yielded with a light push. Opening the door, I found myself inside a cab that seemed to be the control center for the entire train. It was dark here, but my eyes gradually got used to the darkness, and I saw a control panel with numerous levers, buttons, and switches. Everything looked ancient, covered with dust and cobwebs. The smell of an old car was in the air, mixed with a faint smell of burning. I walked up to the panel and began to carefully examine it, looking for something that could be the heart of the train. My hands slid over the metal, touching every detail, trying to figure out how it all worked. But there was nothing to indicate that there was anything special here. And suddenly, when I was about to retreat, I noticed a small hatch under the control panel. It was closed with a small lock, but the lock looked weak and gave way after a few blows. I opened the hatch and saw something that made me freeze in terror. Inside was a small glass container filled with a thick, dark liquid that slowly pulsated like blood. The container was connected to wires and tubes leading to the control panel and then to the entire train. This was the heart, not a mechanical, but a living, pulsating heart of this terrible train. I felt my breathing quicken. I had to stop it, but I didn't know how. Something in me screamed about the danger, about the fact that you can't just touch this liquid. But I knew that if I didn't stop it now, I would be a part of this nightmare, just like Robert. Gathering all my resolve, I pulled the container out of the hatch and felt the train suddenly begin to shake, as if it had been hit by a powerful earthquake wave. The sounds of metal creaking and bending filled the carriage, and I realized that time was short. The train shook more and more, and it seemed that it was about to fall apart. I clutched the container in my hands, feeling its pulsation grow stronger, almost palpable. The dark liquid inside was spinning like a living organism, and I realized that I was holding in my hands not just a mechanism, but something much more dangerous and darker. The mystery was how to stop this heart, break the container, turn off wires. But what if it only makes things worse? My thoughts raced to find an answer. And then I remembered Robert's words. They won't let you go until you become one of them. Something clicked in my head. This fluid is not just blood, it is something more. She was connected to the train, to its terrible passengers, to that dark force that kept everyone trapped. And I realized that the only way to stop it was to destroy the container, to sever the connection between this heart and the train. But how to do it so as not to die? I looked around for anything that might help. An old iron pipe lay on the floor near the control panel. I grabbed it, feeling the weight of the metal in my hands. The only way out was risky, but I saw no other option. I raised the pipe and, gathering all my strength, hit the container. The glass cracked and a dark liquid began to flow out. The train shook even more, and suddenly the carriage was filled with screams. Not mine, but the echoes of dozens of voices coming from different parts of the train. They weren't people, but something that was once alive and now became part of this monstrous mechanism. The liquid kept coming out, and I kept hitting the container until it shattered into pieces. The train suddenly jerked and I fell to the floor, feeling the world around me go black. Time seemed to stand still. I was lying on the cold metal floor, and all around me was darkness and this eerie sound coming from the train that was no longer controlled by this dark force. Suddenly, I felt the train begin to slow down. Its frenzy subsided, and the screams gradually subsided. I slowly rose to my feet, feeling the whole world floating around me. The train slowly stopped, and I understood that something had changed. I may have actually found a way to stop this nightmare. But what now? What will happen to me and those who stayed inside? When the train finally stopped, I approached the car door. Opening them, I saw that there were no rails or a station in front of me, only an empty space that seemed to absorb everything around. But now this space did not cause me fear. It seemed like a new beginning. I stepped into this space, leaving behind the dark carriage, the broken heart, and all the secrets that trapped me. And with each subsequent step, I felt the light returning to my life, and the shadows of this terrible train left far behind. Before I could appreciate what lay ahead, I felt the surrounding space begin to change. The void in front of me filled with blurred outlines, and I realized that it was not just empty space. It was a new world formed from the ruins of the old one. I took a few steps and realized that I was on a huge platform suspended in the unknown. The platform looked old, overgrown with moss, and seemed to be part of some huge mechanism. The wind started blowing again, but now it was softer and not so icy. In front of me were several doors that led to different parts of the platform. Each door had its own special marking, but none of them indicated where it led. I decided to choose the first door that caught my eye. I approached them, but suddenly I heard a small voice coming from the darkness that enveloped the platform. "You can't come back now," came a voice that sounded like a whisper, but with a suspicious undertone. "You made your choice, and now you have to find your way in this new world." I paused for a moment, trying to figure out if it was a real voice or just an echo of my fears, but something inside me pushed me not to stop. I opened the door and stepped into a new space. It was a large hall that resembled an abandoned factory with high ceilings and huge metal structures. The air smelled of old grease and rust. I found myself in the center of a huge mechanism that seemed to be part of this platform. Many of the details looked familiar, like parts of a falling train. I looked around and realized that all I could see were parts of the horrible world I found myself in. But here was something new, an old mechanism that looked like the heart of this new world, with its many gears and wires. They were all connected in a complex system that controlled everything that happened around. I got closer and noticed that in the center of the mechanism was a small room with a metal door. The key parts of this mechanism were painted red, and this caught my attention. It turned out that these parts connect to different parts of the platform. I decided to go into the room, hoping that it might be a way out or a clue to what was going on. I went to the door and opened it. Inside was a room filled with old papers and records. On the floor was a notebook filled with drawings and notes. I started looking through the records, and one of them caught my attention. It was a blueprint of a train that described its construction and various functions. In one of the records, I found an explanation for what happened. The train was not just a means of transport, but part of a larger experiment. It was a mechanism that controlled interspatial transitions, transforming reality and time. I understood that my goal now was to find a way to stop this mechanism forever. The notebooks and blueprints contained hints on how to disable this system, but to do so required disassembling all the components and finding a way to the central control. I got up again, looked around, and realized that a new part of this nightmare needed my understanding and patience to understand all the details of the mechanism and find a way out of this world. A new fight for survival had begun, and I was ready to solve all the remaining mysteries and find a way to break free from this sinister world. I continued to look at the documents and drawings lying on the floor of the room. In one of the sheets, I found a detailed description of the mechanism that controlled spatial transitions. It seemed that in the center of this mechanism, there is something like the main control panel, which is responsible for activating and deactivating the entire system. Among the records, I found several diagrams describing how to disable this system. It turned out that this required finding and destroying the three main components of the mechanism: the main controller, the energy generator, and the reservoir of dark liquid. I needed to find these components and destroy them to free myself from this world. I went in search of the master controller. According to the drawings, it should have been located in one of the sections of the platform. I walked through some dark corridors and rooms that looked like they hadn't been used in a long time. Each of these rooms contained remnants of old mechanisms and various parts, confirming that this platform had once been part of a larger system. Finally, I came upon a large metal box standing in the corner of the room. A large castle was located on it. I opened it, and inside I found a control panel with numerous buttons and levers. I began to study it, hoping to find a way to disable the system. After a few minutes of trying, I found a lever that looked like it could be the main controller. I pressed it, and suddenly the whole mechanism began to shake, and the light in the room flickered. I understand that this could be part of the system activation, but will this help stop it? While I was pondering my next course of action, I heard footsteps behind me. My nerves were on edge and I began to feel the fear that I was being followed again. I turned quickly to see a figure in the darkness moving in my direction. I hid behind a large mechanism and began to wait, hoping that the figure would not notice me. She came closer, and I recognized that it was not just a person, but one of the terrifying ghostly figures that Robert had written about. She was in the dark again, but I could see that her eyes were glowing red. I decided to act quickly. I pulled out some tools I found in the room and started using them to take apart the control panel. My goal was clear: find and destroy the master controller before the ghostly figure could find me. I worked without taking my eyes off the door where this horrible creature could enter. As I tried to disassemble the remote, I could clearly feel how every sound, every movement of the ghostly figure instilled more fear into me. Finally, I found the internal mechanism of the remote control and realized that it is responsible for the basic control of the entire system. I pulled out a few key parts and broke the connection, trying to destroy its functions as quickly as possible. The mechanism began to rust and crack, but the figure continued to approach. I finished my work and left the room hoping to find the power generator. I walked down a few more corridors until I finally came upon a large room filled with various electrical components and a large generator that pulsated with light. It was the second component that required destruction. I started looking for ways to stop the generator. According to the drawings, it was necessary to find and destroy the main energy element. I carefully approached the generator and found the necessary element in the inner compartment. When disassembling the generator, I tried to avoid any mistakes so as not to cause a short circuit or an explosion. As soon as I pulled out the power cell, the generator started rusting and sparking. The mechanism began to thump and quiet down. I knew time was running out and I had to find the tank of dark liquid. I continued my search, moving further into the darkness of this terrible world. I set off in search of the reservoir of dark liquid, hoping to find it before the rest of the mechanism began to threaten my life again. As I walked through the various rooms, I noticed that the platform was beginning to show signs of degradation. The walls were collapsing, parts of the structures were beginning to fall off. The feeling of instability grew with each step. In one of the premises, I found an old laboratory where there were various containers and containers. Many scientific instruments and materials were collected here, which seemed to indicate that the site had previously been used for research. I began to scrutinize the lab, hoping to find what I was looking for. Among the many containers and glasses, I came across a large tank filled with a thick, dark liquid similar to the one I had seen before. This tank was part of the system, and it looked even more ominous compared to the previous one. According to the drawings, to destroy the tank, it was necessary to first disconnect all connections and carry out a special deconstruction process. I found some tools laying around and got to work on disconnecting the tubes and wires going to the tank. My goal was clear: to sever all connections so that fluid could no longer flow through the system. As I worked, the platform began to shake even more and I could feel parts of the structure falling around me. I sensed that time was not on my side and worked at top speed trying to avoid any damage. The tank began to rust and the liquid inside began to bubble as if it were alive. I continued to disconnect the connections and was finally able to remove the main valve that controlled the flow of fluid. When I opened the faucet, the liquid started leaking and the tank became unstable. I tried to get out of the lab, but suddenly I felt one of the walls start to collapse. I managed to jump out of the room and hide behind the nearest mechanism, watching the laboratory collapse behind me. The whole world around me began to crumble, and I realized that I needed to find a way out before the platform fell on its full tilt. I ran across the platform, over debris, and finally found a hatch that led to the outside. I quickly broke it and climbed to the surface where I saw the platform begin to sink into the void. It was dark and cold here, but a new space opened before me, as if I was on the edge of a bottomless abyss. I saw that all around me were the fragments of old mechanisms and parts of the platform drifting in the boundless space. I looked back at the collapsing platforms and saw parts of it slowly disappearing into the darkness. All three components of the mechanism were destroyed, and now the place could no longer support its structure. I felt that my struggle was coming to an end, but I could not yet fully understand what lay ahead. I kept moving forward, looking for a way out of this nightmare world. In the distance, I saw a faint light that seemed to be the only direction I could go. I focused my energies on reaching that light, hoping it would lead to freedom or a new beginning. I continued to move towards the faint light that seemed to be the only hope for salvation. Every step was filled with fear and a sense of danger as the wreckage of the old platform continued to fly around me, falling into the endless darkness. But I was going to find a way out, against all odds. The light in front of me grew brighter, and I noticed that it came from a large circular portal suspended in the air. It looked like a huge, glowing orb, emitting a soft yet bright light that illuminated the way. I approached the portal and felt its light penetrate me, trying to calm the anxiety. But before I could approach the portal, I suddenly felt the platform beneath my feet begin to shake again. The mechanism, it seems, had not yet completely stopped, and the remnants of the old system continued to operate on an automatic level. I tried to stay on my feet and accelerated, trying to keep up with the moving platform. When I finally reached the portal, I noticed that it had several large buttons and levers controlling its functions. The panel next to the portal had written instructions that appeared to explain how to activate it. I started studying these instructions, trying to figure out how to stop this portal and go through it. In one part of the instructions, I found that to activate the portal, you need to open a special mechanism and enter a code. I looked at the code and realized that it matched certain parts of the platform that I had seen before. I started typing in the code, hoping it would work. While entering the code, I felt something was wrong. The portal began to shake again and explode with flashes of light. I saw new, terrifying figures appear around me, approaching from the darkness, and I knew that this might be the last challenge before I found my liberation. I remembered to keep calm and act quickly. I finished entering the code and activated the levers, hoping that would resolve the situation. The portal began to glow again, and I felt its energy begin to push away the darkness around me. With each passing moment, the light grew brighter, and the figures of darkness began to retreat. I took a few deep breaths and stepped into the portal with determination. The feeling was as if I was passing through a living liquid that changes the surrounding space. When I stepped out of the portal, I found myself in a new environment. It was a light and safe place that contrasted with everything I had experienced before. All around me was green grass, blue sky, and a light wind that brought the sense of nature. I realized that this could be a new beginning, a place where I could rebuild my life. But even here, in this new world, I could not feel complete peace. I understood that the events that had taken place had left a mark on me, and now I had to find a way to cope with everything that I had experienced. I took a deep breath and started walking forward, hoping that this new part of the world would bring me peace and new opportunities to start a new chapter in life. But every step of the way I remained alert, ready for any turn that might bring me back into the darkness.